Sheriff Brody shifted his weight on the mercantile porch, the worn wood groaning under his boots. The cold was a physical thing, a presence that pressed in from the street and settled deep in the bone. Across from him, Henderson polished a glass jar with a grey rag, his movement small and precise, as if conserving heat. "No sign, then," Henderson said. It was not a question. It was the closing of a ledger, the final tally of a loss. Brody stared out at the hard-packed snow of the main street, the ruts frozen into permanence. None. Trapper who came down from the North Ridge saw some tracks a week ago, heading high. Dog tracks and a smaller set. But the last snow covered everything. "There's nothing left to follow." Henderson placed the gleaming jar back on the shelf, its emptiness a small, clear monument. "It's a shame. To last that long in the foundling home, just to be turned out into this." His voice was low, factual. There was no pity in it, only the quiet accounting of a grim reality. The world was what it was. Winter was what it was. Brody pulled his collar tighter. He remembered the girl, Rowan, from the few times he'd been called to the home. A quiet thing, all sharp angles and eyes that saw more than she ever spoke. She had a dog that was always with her, a big shepherd mix that watched everyone and trusted no one but her. Matron Davison said she had no choice. 17 is 17. The charter is plain. Henderson grunted, a sound of assent that required no thought. Plain is one thing. Right is another. But the charter don't care about a blizzard. And a girl of 17, with just a dog, she never had a chance. The mountain takes what it wants. He looked at Brody then, his gaze direct. You won't find her. Not until the thaw of the implication hung in the frozen air between them. What they would find in the spring would not be a person, but a body. A task for a shovel, not a search party. Brody knew he was right. He was a man who believed in the evidence of his own eyes, in the solid, unforgiving logic of the world. And the logic of this world was that a lone girl could not survive a winter in the high country. It was an impossibility. You could no more will yourself warm than you could stop the sun from setting. Some things you can't outrun, Brody said, the words clouding in front of his face. The winter is one. He felt a pang of something, a dull ache of responsibility that had no practical outlet. He was the law, but he couldn't arrest the cold or serve a warrant on a snowstorm. All he could do was stand on a porch and confirm what everyone already knew to be true. The girl was gone. She had walked out of town and into a story that was already over. The door of the St. Jude's foundling home was made of heavy oak, and it closed with the sound of a lock turning in a vault. Rowan stood on the other side of it, her hand still raised from a knock that had never landed. She had not begged. She had not cried. She had simply taken the thin wool blanket and the small, dense loaf of bread from Matron Davison's hands and turned away. The matron's final words had been as spare and cold as the landscape. The charter is plain. 17. You are of age. There had been no malice in the woman's face, only a weary resignation, the expression of someone who had spent a lifetime enforcing rules she had not made. Behind Rowan, the German shepherd, Fenn, whined softly, a low thrum of distress in his chest. He pressed against her leg, a solid, living anchor in a world that had just dissolved. The wind cut across the small, bare yard of the home, lifting fine crystals of snow and stinging her cheeks. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, the rough wool a poor defense against the deepening cold. For a moment, she allowed herself to look back at the institution that had been her entire world. It was not a home, but a container. A place of bells and rules and the constant, low-grade hunger for something more than what was given. She had never belonged there, but it had been a place to exist. Now, even that was gone. She was untethered, a loose thread in the vast, frozen fabric of the world. She looked down at Fenn. His amber eyes watched her, waiting for a command, for a direction. He was the only thing in her life that was truly hers, the one creature whose loyalty was not subject to a charter or a matron's decree. He was her history and her future, all contained in a body of muscle and fur and unwavering devotion. She touched the top of his head, her fingers sinking into his thick coat. The town lay below, a handful of wooden buildings hunkered down against the coming storm, smoke rising from their chimneys in pale, fragile columns. She knew, with a certainty that needed no proof, that there was no place for her there. Every door was a version of the one that had just closed. She turned her back on the town and faced the mountains. They rose in the distance, a wall of white and grey stone, their peaks lost in the low, bruised sky. They were not welcoming. They promised nothing. But they were not a closed door. They were an opening, a vast and dangerous emptiness that was, at least, her own to enter. Her father, a man she remembered only in fragments, in the scent of pine sap and the feel of a calloused hand, had spoken of the high ridges. He had been a prospector, a man who read the land like a book. He'd told her stories of hidden valleys and strange winds, of places the cold could not touch. They were just stories, thin as smoke. But they were all she had. The ascent was a silent battle waged against gravity and cold. Rowan moved with a steady, unhurried rhythm, her boots sinking into the deepening snow. Each step was an act of will, a small victory against the mountain's crushing indifference. The town shrank below her, its small noises fading until all that was left was the sound of her own breathing and the soft crunch of Fenn's paws beside her. The dog moved with an easy power she envied, his head up, tasting the air. He was not fighting the mountain, he was a part of it. The wind was a constant, keening presence, stripping warmth from her with surgical precision. It found the gaps in her worn coat, the space between her scarf and her collar, the thin fabric of her mittens. The cold was no longer just a sensation, it felt like a slow-moving liquid, seeping into her skin, her muscles, her bones. The memory of her father's voice was a flickering ember in the cold furnace of her mind. He had not given her a map. He had given her a feeling, a description of a place where the rocks breathed. "You find the old rockfall," he had whispered, his voice a low rumble in a memory that was more dream than fact. "Below the twin peaks that look like a hawk's broken wing. There's a scar in the stone. An old wound. The air is different there." It was a mad thing to chase, a ghost story in a blizzard. But it was the only story she had left. She focused on the details in front of her, the pattern of frost on a pine needle, the dark, unblinking eye of a raven watching from a high branch, the way Fenn's breath plumed and vanished. These small, solid things kept her tethered to the present moment, preventing her mind from sliding into the abyss of what if. What if the story was just a story? What if the mountain was just a mountain? What if she was just a girl, freezing to death on a hillside? She pushed the thoughts away. She could not afford them. They were a luxury, like a warm fire or a full belly. She could only afford the next step, and the one after that. Hours passed. The sun was a weak, milky disk behind a veil of cloud, offering light but no warmth. Her legs ached with a deep, burning fatigue. Her face was numb. And then she saw it. High above, two jagged peaks tore at the sky, one slightly stooped, like a bird's fractured pinion. The hawk's broken wing. Below them, a massive, ancient rockfall cascaded down the slope, a river of stone frozen in time. A flicker of something that was not quite hope, but a grim, vital determination, surged through her. She was in the right place. Now she had to find the scar. She moved along the base of the rockfall, her mittened hand trailing against the immense, cold stones. Fenn ranged ahead, his nose to the ground, then to the air. He stopped, his body tensed, his head cocked. He looked back at her, a low whine in his throat. He was near a fissure in the cliff face, a dark, vertical slash almost hidden by a snow-dusted overhang of rock. It was no more than a shadow, an absence of light. A wound. Rowan approached it slowly. The air at the entrance was still, dead, colder than the wind-scoured slope. It smelled of damp stone and deep earth, a scent of things that had not seen the sun in 1,000 years. This was it. She did not know if it would save her, but she knew it was the place from the story. She ducked under the overhang and stepped out of the wind. The silence was immediate and absolute. The entrance to the cave was a throat of ice. Cold radiated from the stone walls, and the air was heavy with the damp chill of a cellar. For the first 20 feet, it was just a narrow passage, the floor slick with a thin veneer of frost. Fen stayed close, his body pressed against her leg, his unease a palpable thing. It was a tomb, not a shelter. Rowan's hope, so fragile to begin with, began to wither. The story was just a story. The mountain was just a mountain. But retreat was not an option. To go back into the wind was to die. To stay here was to die slowly. The only unknown path was forward, deeper into the dark. She pushed on, one hand braced against the rough, cold wall. The darkness was complete, a thick, palpable blackness that swallowed the faint light from the entrance. She was moving by touch alone, her boots scuffing on the uneven rock floor. She could feel Fen's warm breath on her hand, a small point of life in the immense deadness of the rock. It was the dog who sensed it first. He pulled ahead, his initial reluctance replaced by a strange, questing urgency. She heard his claws clicking on the stone, the sound echoing in the confined space. Then he stopped. She reached out, her hand finding his flank. He was perfectly still, his nose pointed forward into the dark. And then she felt it. It was not a blast of heat, not a current of wind. It was a change in the quality of the air itself. The biting, damp chill lessened, replaced by something neutral, then something that felt almost temperate. It was the most subtle of shifts, a change a person desperate for warmth might imagine. But the dog felt it too. He moved forward again, more confidently this time, and she followed. The passage began to widen. She shuffled forward, her hands outstretched, until they met not stone, but empty space. She had entered a larger chamber. The air here was distinctly different. It was not warm like a fireside, but it was not cold. It held a steady, constant temperature that felt miraculous. She took off a mitten and held up her bare hand. The air that touched her skin was cool, but it did not steal her heat. It was alive. She moved deeper into the chamber, her feet sure on the dry, dusty floor. She could feel the immensity of the space around her, the ceiling arching high above. Following the feeling, the source of this impossible temperance, she traced the wall of the chamber. About 60 feet from the narrow entrance passage, she found it. A series of fissures in the rock, some no wider than her hand. And from them, a slow, gentle, and unmistakably warm breath of air emanated. It was the mountain. It was breathing. Geothermal heat, bleeding up from the deep arteries of the earth. Her father's story was real. This was the place the cold could not touch. Tears she had refused to shed at the orphanage door now froze on her cheeks in the entrance passage as she returned for her meager supplies. They were not tears of sorrow, but of a stark, overwhelming relief that was so profound it felt like pain. She was not saved. Survival was not a single event, but 1,000 arduous tasks yet to be done. But she had a chance. In the warm, dark heart of the breathing mountain, she had found a place to begin. The work began before the relief had fully settled. A chance was not a home. It was merely the foundation, and she had to build upon it, stone by stone. The first task was light. She sacrificed a strip of her blanket, threading it with tallow from the last of her bread and dripping rations, creating a crude, smoky lamp. In its flickering, amber glow, the chamber revealed itself. It was vast, larger than the main hall of the foundling home, with a high, vaulted ceiling that drank the light. The floor was mostly level, a dry, packed earth that felt solid underfoot. The walls were a tapestry of rock formations, smooth in some places, jagged in others. And on the far side were the fissures, the source of the life-giving warmth, breathing a faint, shimmering haze into the air. Her days fell into a relentless rhythm, dictated by need and the slow turning of the weak winter sun. The entrance of the cave remained her connection to the outside world, and her greatest vulnerability. It was there she built her first true structure, a low, U-shaped wall of stacked, dry stone, creating a windbreak just inside the passage. It was brutal work. Her hands, protected only by thin mittens, were raw and bleeding within hours, the cold of the stones seeping through to the bone. Each rock was a dead weight she had to pry from the frozen ground or wrestle from the cave walls, her small frame straining. But with every stone she placed, the shelter felt more real, more hers. Inside the great warm chamber, she built her living space. She partitioned off a smaller area with another low wall, creating a room within the room. This would conserve the warmth and provide a sense of enclosure against the overwhelming dark. She gathered fallen pine boughs from the slopes below, dragging them back to the cave to create a thick, fragrant mattress on a raised platform of flat stones. This lifted her off the ground, away from any lingering chill in the earth. The biggest challenge was firewood. While the chamber was warm, she needed fire at the cave mouth for cooking and for melting snow for water. The warmth did not reach the entrance, and any smoke in the main chamber would be suffocating. So each day, she and Fen would venture out. The dog was her scout, her guard, his keen senses alerting her to the slide of snow or the distant snap of a branch that might signal a predator. She gathered deadfall, her small axe echoing in the profound silence of the forest. She never went far. She would haul the wood back, stacking it meticulously along the wall of the entrance passage, a bulwark of fuel that was also a measure of her security. Weeks compressed into a single, sustained effort. She learned the mountain's habits, where the snow was shallowest, which trees shed the most deadwood, the precise moment the light failed behind the high peaks. Her body changed, the soft edges of girlhood planed away, leaving lean muscle and a resilience that surprised her. Her hands became tools, calloused and scarred. She spoke little, only quiet commands to Fen and sometimes, soft words to herself, a habit to keep the crushing silence at bay. She was utterly alone, but she was not lonely. The mountain was a presence, and the cave was her partner in survival. It was a silent, breathing entity that had taken her in. She did not own it, she was its guest, and she tended to it with a quiet, fierce devotion. The small, protected space she had built 60 feet from the wind was more of a home than any place she had ever known. Sheriff Brody was not a man given to flights of fancy. He trusted the solid ground, the heft of his pistol, and the clear, unambiguous language of a well-laid track in the snow. He was following the trail of a mountain lion that had been harassing the lower homesteads, a big male, judging by the size of the paw prints. The tracks led him high, up into the steep, inhospitable ridges east of town, a place most men avoided even in the height of summer. The snow was deep here, the going slow. He was considering turning back when he saw it, a thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke rising against a grey rock face. It was so faint he thought it was a trick of the light, his eyes watering from the cold. But it held steady. A fire. Up here. It made no sense. No sane person would make camp this high in this weather. His first thought was the lost prospector, a man named Peters who had gone missing 2 months ago. Perhaps he had holed up, injured but alive. Brody tethered his horse and continued on foot, his hand resting on the butt of his sidearm. As he drew closer, the smoke seemed to vanish, dissolving into the air. But he had its location fixed. He rounded a massive outcrop of granite and saw the dark slash in the cliffside. A cave. The smoke had been coming from its mouth. He approached cautiously, calling out, "Hello? Anyone in there?" The only answer was the wind. He drew his pistol, the cold metal a familiar weight in his hand, and stepped inside. The entrance was frigid, the air still and sharp. A small, carefully constructed stone windbreak stood just inside, and behind it, the remains of a tiny, smouldering fire. The smoke was being drawn cleverly upwards along the rock face, dispersing before it could form a thick column. Smart. But as he moved deeper, the cold intensified. This was no place to live. It was a place to die slowly. He took another step into the darkness and stopped dead. A low growl echoed from the blackness ahead, a deep and resonant threat. It was not the sound of a wolf or a cougar. It was a dog. A big one. "Easy now," Brody said, his voice steady. And then, a girl's voice, quiet and clear, cut through the dark. "Fen, enough." The growling subsided, replaced by a tense silence. A moment later, a figure emerged from the deeper passage, holding a small, flickering tallow lamp. The light illuminated a face he recognized with a jolt of disbelief. It was the girl from the orphanage. Rowan. She was thinner, her face sharper, but her eyes were the same, steady, watchful, and holding no surprise at the sight of him. She was not just alive, she was calm. He stared at her, at the clean state of her clothes, at the solid presence of the huge dog at her side. He looked around at the stacked firewood, the neat windbreak. His mind struggled to reconcile the scene with the absolute certainty of her death. "How are you alive?" The question came out harsher than he intended, an accusation born of sheer cognitive dissonance. She did not flinch. She simply held his gaze, the small flame of her lamp reflecting in her eyes. "The hill is warm," she said. It was not an explanation. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the quiet authority of someone stating the sun rises in the east. He had no idea what it meant. He looked past her, into the impenetrable darkness from which she had emerged. It seemed impossible that anything but a colder death lay in that direction. He was a man who trusted what he could see, and what he saw was a girl who should be a frozen corpse, living in a block of ice with a ghost story for a reason. He lowered his pistol, feeling foolish and profoundly unsettled. He mumbled something about tracking a lion, about seeing the smoke. He backed away, out of the cave's frozen mouth and into the familiar, biting wind. The world outside made sense. The world inside that hill did not. He rode back to town with the girl's impossible statement echoing in his head. The hill is warm. The blizzard arrived without warning. It was not a storm, it was a whiteout, a vertical and horizontal wall of snow and wind that erased the world. The sky and the land merged into a single, churning vortex of white. Sheriff Brody was caught miles from town, checking a trap line near the old logging camp, when it hit. One moment, he could see the tree line. The next, he could not see his horse's ears. The wind was a physical force, a battering ram that threatened to tear him from the saddle. The temperature plummeted. He knew, with the cold, hard certainty of a man who had lived his whole life in these mountains, that his chances of making it back to town were close to zero. The horse stumbled, its leg plunging into a hidden drift, and went down with a high, panicked scream. Brody was thrown clear, his shoulder hitting a buried rock with a sickening crunch of bone and cartilage. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot through him. He struggled to his feet, the world tilting. The horse was flailing, its leg broken. A wave of grim finality washed over him. He did what had to be done, the single shot of his pistol shockingly loud and then instantly swallowed by the roaring wind. Now he was alone. And he was going to die. He began to walk, leaning into the wind, though he had no real idea which direction he was heading. The cold was a predator, stalking him, draining the strength from his limbs. His thoughts grew sluggish, his vision starting to tunnel. He was freezing to death, and he knew it. And then, through the fog of his failing mind, a single, impossible thought surfaced: the hill is warm. It was a memory of the girl, Rowan, standing in the mouth of that cold cave. It was madness. A fairy tale. But it was the only direction his mind could offer. He didn't know if he was even walking toward the high ridges, but he fixed the image of the cave in his mind and forced one frozen boot in front of the other. He stumbled on for what felt like hours, driven by a primal instinct that had overridden conscious thought. He was on the verge of collapse, his body ready to surrender, when something solid slammed into his side. It was Fen, the girl's dog, a phantom of fur and teeth materializing out of the white chaos. The dog barked, a sharp, urgent sound, and nudged him, pushing him in a new direction. Brody followed, his last reserves of strength marshaled by the animal's presence. The dog led him to the base of a cliff, to a dark opening that was almost invisible in the storm. The cave. Rowan was there, at the entrance, a small, still figure wrapped in her thin blanket. She must have sent the dog for him. She and the dog guided him inside, out of the screaming wind. He collapsed just inside the passage, his body shaking uncontrollably. He was still freezing, the deep cold of his bones fighting a losing battle. Rowan looked at him, her expression unreadable. She said nothing. She simply took his arm and, with the dog helping to brace him, led him deeper, past the windbreak, past the stacks of wood, into the profound and utter darkness of the inner cave. And as he crossed the threshold into the great chamber, the impossible happened. The shaking began to subside. The air on his face was not warm, but it was not killing him. It was a gentle, steady coolness that felt, to his frostbitten skin, like a summer breeze. He was 60 feet inside a mountain of rock, in the heart of a blizzard that was scouring the world clean, and he was no longer freezing. He was safe. His certainty, the bedrock of his entire life, had been shattered. He was alive because of a truth he had dismissed as a child's fantasy. When the blizzard finally broke 2 days later, the world was remade in white, silent and dazzling under a painfully bright sun. Sheriff Brody emerged from the cave like a man reborn, his shoulder a throbbing ache, but his mind sharp with a new and unsettling clarity. He had survived. And he owed his life to a 17-year-old girl and her breathing hill. He looked back at Rowan, who stood at the entrance with Fen, watching him. "I'll send someone up," he said. It was an inadequate thing to say, a pebble of gratitude dropped into an ocean of debt. She just nodded, accepting the words for what they were. Back in town, his story was met with a mixture of awe and deep-seated skepticism. He was alive, that was a fact no one could dispute. But his explanation of a warm cave, a pocket of spring in the dead of winter, strained the limits of belief. It sounded like the fever dream of a half-frozen man. Brody knew that his word alone was not enough to change the town's mind. He needed a different kind of witness. He went to the mercantile, not to see Henderson, but his wife, Martha. She was a woman of immense practicality, who dealt in flour and salt and saw the world as a series of problems to be solved. And he went to the small cottage at the edge of town where Maeve, the oldest woman in the valley, lived. Maeve's memory was a library of things the town had forgotten. The next morning, a small party made the arduous trek up the mountain, Brody, Martha, and Maeve, who rode a placid old mare. When they reached the cave, Rowan was there, waiting. She showed them in, her silence a more powerful guide than any speech. Martha ran her bare hand over the stone of the inner chamber, her brow furrowed in concentration. She felt the dry floor, the temperate air. Her practical mind was working, calculating, processing the impossible data. But it was Maeve who understood. She stood in the center of the great chamber, her eyes closed, a small, knowing smile on her wrinkled face. She breathed in deeply. "I remember," she whispered, her voice thin and dry as a leaf. "My grandmother told me the stories. The Ute called this place the Winter's Heart. They said the mountain had a fire in its belly. A place where life could hold on when the world was white. We forgot. When the town came, with its big stoves and its deep cellars, we forgot how to listen to the land." She opened her eyes and looked at Rowan, a deep and ancient understanding passing between the old woman and the young one. "You didn't forget," Maeve said. "You listened." In that moment, Rowan's existence was transformed. She was no longer an anomaly, a strange girl who had gotten lucky. She was the keeper of a knowledge that had been lost, the living heir to a history the town had paved over. Maeve's words gave her discovery a name and a lineage, rooting it in the deep soil of the past. Brody watched the exchange, feeling the foundations of his world settling into a new and more complex arrangement. The law was written in books, but the truth, he was beginning to understand, was written in the stone. Martha Henderson was not a woman moved by folklore. She heard Maeve's story of the Winter's Heart, but what she saw was a solution. She saw a place that defied the rules of winter, and her mind, always turning on the practical gears of survival and commerce, immediately began to calculate its value. The town's respect could not be won with stories, it had to be earned with utility. And Martha saw, with startling clarity, how useful Rowan could be. She did not organize a town meeting or make a grand pronouncement. Her methods were quieter, more direct. A few days after their visit, a canvas-wrapped parcel appeared at the mouth of Rowan's cave. Inside was a 50-pound sack of flour, a slab of salt pork, a small cast-iron pot, and a new, sharp axe head. There was no note. It was not a gift, but an investment. A down payment. Rowan understood the transaction immediately. It was not charity, which she would have rejected. It was an exchange. She took the supplies, and a week later, she left a bundle of dried herbs at the mercantile's back door for Martha. They were herbs that shouldn't have been growing, found in the warmer soil near the cave's geothermal fissures. Martha recognized them as a potent remedy for the lung sickness that always plagued the town's children in deep winter. The exchange was sealed. A silent partnership was formed. Slowly, cautiously, the community began to change its relationship with the girl on the mountain. The change was not driven by sentiment, but by need. That winter was long and brutal. The lower pastures were buried in snow, and fodder for the livestock ran dangerously low. Brody, remembering the patches of clear ground high on the southern face of Rowan's Mountain, asked her if she knew of any sheltered grazing. She did. She led him to a high, hidden basin, protected from the wind and warmed by the same underground heat, where the grass was still accessible. It saved half a dozen homesteads from ruin. The parcels at her cave mouth became more frequent. A lantern and oil. A set of proper woolens. A bag of seed potatoes. In return, Rowan provided knowledge. She knew the mountain's secrets now. She knew where the springs ran even in the deepest freeze, where the game sheltered from the storms, which rockfalls were stable and which were not. She became a resource, a quiet oracle of the high country. They did not pry into her life. They did not ask her to come down and live among them. They respected her isolation, her strangeness. They began to see her not as the outcast from the foundling home, but as a part of the landscape itself, as essential and mysterious as the mountain she inhabited. Martha facilitated it all, the quiet broker in this new economy of survival. She translated the town's needs into practical goods and Rowan's Mountain knowledge into tangible benefits. The community, which had cast the girl out to die, was now quietly, methodically, and gratefully weaving her back into its fabric, not as a lost child, but as a vital and necessary thread. 10 years passed. The snows of 10 winters had fallen and melted. The path to the cave on the high ridge was no longer a faint track, but a well-worn trail, visible even in summer. Rowan was no longer a girl, but a woman. She still lived in the heart of the mountain, in the warm, dark chamber that had saved her, but she was not a hermit. The cave was no longer a refuge from the world, but her place within it. It was a home, solid and real, the center from which her life radiated. She moved between the high country and the town with a quiet confidence, a recognized figure whose presence no longer caused whispers. She was the one they came to when a calf was lost in a summer storm, or when a child wandered too far into the woods. She could read the land in a way no one else could, her knowledge as deep and certain as the rock beneath her feet. Fen was gone, his life a long and loyal service that had ended peacefully 3 winters past. A new dog, a pup of his line, now lay by the entrance to the cave, his amber eyes watchful. Sheriff Brody was older now, his hair gone to grey, his movements stiffer. The injury to his shoulder in the great blizzard ached in the cold, a constant, physical reminder of the day his certainty had broken. He would sometimes ride up to the cave and sit with her, the two of them sharing a silence that was more comfortable than any conversation. He never spoke of the day she had saved him, and she never mentioned it. The debt was a known thing between them, a permanent part of the foundation of their respect. He had been the agent of the community's verdict, and she had become the instrument of his humbling. Maeve was gone, too, her stories absorbed back into the silence of the land. But the name she had given the cave, the Winter's Heart, had stuck. The people of the valley used it now as a landmark, a point of orientation. North of the Winter's Heart, they would say, or just below the ridge of the heart, the mountain's secret had become part of their shared language, its warmth a known fact of their world. On a clear autumn evening, Rowan stood at the mouth of her cave, looking down at the valley. The lights of the town were beginning to flicker on, small, golden points of life in the deepening twilight. She was not one of them, not entirely. But she was not separate, either. She was a guardian of a knowledge they had needed, a memory they had forgotten. The town had cast her out, and the mountain had taken her in. And in doing so, it had given her back to them, not as what they thought she was, a poor, disposable orphan, but as what she had always been, a survivor, a listener, a quiet and essential piece of the world. The warm air of the cave breathed at her back, a constant, faithful presence. It was the mountain spirit, and it had become her own.